Hi, this is Rob Hill, certified Cicerone with Total Wine and More, and I'm standing in front of Flying Dog Brewery in Frederick, Maryland. We're about to go inside and meet the people behind these great beers. Join us and discover Flying Dog.
We are in the Brewhouse, or the hot side as we call it, and we actually brew wort, not beer. It starts with malted barley from the fields. Outside there are 3 silos that each hold 100,000 pounds worth of grain. That's our bulk grain. The bags that you see stacked on the shelves are our specialty malts, and those add both color and flavor to the beer. Everything from some caramel sweetness to that espresso chocolate flavor and so forth. The grain goes through a mill. We crush the husks, exposing the nutrient-rich endosperm, and then we transfer it into the mash mixer. Beer is a biochemical process, so enzymatic reactions take place in the mash mixer at temperatures that reach up to about 165 degrees. And 2 main things happen. Large starch carbohydrate molecules are broken down into small sugar molecules, primarily maltose, that the yeast can metabolize during the fermentation process, and large protein molecules are broken down into amino acids, which are essential for the metabolic process as well. After the mash mixer, we raise the temperature to stop that enzymatic reaction and transfer the grain to the lauter tun. The lauter tun is a vessel unique to the brewing industry. It has a false bottom to it, and we transfer the grain in there. It forms a grain bed, and we do 2 things. The first is called Vorlauf. That's a German term, and we recycle that wort through the grain bed to eliminate any particles that are going to be in the wort. We clarify the wort, and then we sparge it. We run hot water through it so we extract the maximum amount of sugar. One of the brewer's efficiencies is to extract the maximum amount of sugar out of the grain, and consistent with the recipe. We use over 5 million pounds of grain per year. Grain went up 3 or 4 cents a pound, so obviously we want to get the maximum efficiency out of the grain. Once we have the clear wort, or sugar water, we transfer it to these brew kettles. These kettles are 50 barrels, a barrel's 31 gallons, so each one of these kettles is 1,500 gallons, and they do go below the floor. And we boil the wort for 4 reasons. The first is, for the first 15 minutes or so, we can kill off any bacteria that might have come in with the grain through the field that could cause off flavors in the wort or off flavors in the beer. The second is to flash off some volatile compounds that could cause off flavors in the beer. The third is we concentrate the wort so that that sugar concentration reaches the level that's called for in the recipe. But most importantly, from a consumer standpoint, we add hops during the boil. The earlier we add the hops, the more bitterness you get on the palate. The later we add the hops, the more of the aromatic characteristics that you get. So this boiling process is the first step in putting the bitterness into the beer. Again, our biggest beers with the highest bitterness units, we're adding hops continuously throughout the process. Once that boiling process is complete, we need to spin out some particles, some of the barley particles, the hop particles, the coagulated proteins. We do that in a whirlpool, and then we have to chill it. Yeast is a single-celled organism, and it would feel just as we would if we were thrown into boiling water. So the desirable temperature for yeast is in the 60-degree range, 65 to 68 degrees on average. It depends on which type of beer we're brewing. And we do that through a heat exchanger. Now, a heat exchanger is nothing more than plates with cold water on one side and the hot wort on the other. The heat transfers from the hot to the cold, and we chill that wort to about 68 degrees. In the brewing industry, water is called liquor, so we have hot liquor tanks and cold liquor tanks. The water that was cold and warmed by the hot wort is transferred to the hot liquor tank and then recirculated through the process. So we recapture some energy that's used in the brewing process. And then once we have the wort cooled down to the desirable temperature, we transfer it to fermentation, where the magic takes place. We're now in the fermentation cellar, so we've transferred the warm, nutrient-rich wort into these cylindric conical, or unit tanks as they're called, and we pitch yeast into it. In the brewing industry, adding yeast is called pitching yeast. And the first step in the process, the yeast has no interest in making beer. The yeast is reproducing. So during the primary phase of fermentation, the yeast is reproducing very dramatically. We end up with about 5 times as much yeast as we started with. And the byproducts of that reproduction are ethanol, alcohol, and CO2. So much head pressure builds up with CO2 from the fermentation process that we have to blow it off into these barrels. The CO2 combines with water, forms carbonic acid. We don't want to fill the room with CO2, but that's how much energy is being created just during this primary fermentation. In most of our beers, the primary fermentation is 5 to 7 days, and then it settles down and we chill it so that the yeast flocculates or floats to the bottom, and then we harvest it from the bottom. Some of that yeast is put into the trub tank, TRUB, and hauled away to the farmers. Others, part of that yeast is repropagated and used for the next batch. We get about, depends on the yeast, about 7 generations from each of our yeasts. Then the second stage of fermentation is the maturation. Depending on the beer, our beers take from 17 to 45 days to go through primary fermentation and maturation. In general, the ales ferment at warmer temperatures and faster, and you get more of those complex caramel flavors. The lagers ferment slower and colder, and you get that very dry, crisp, clean finish to it. And we do a lot of hybrids too. We use lager yeast at ale temperatures to create our amber lager. After primary fermentation, the beer is filtered, or can be filtered. We don't pasteurize beers. What we do is we filter them. So depending on the beer style, some beers are not filtered at all, such as our Hefeweizen, which translates to yeast wheat. And that's a very cloudy beer, and that yeast imparts very desirable flavor characteristics. Other beers are either partially filtered or even polish filtered. So by doing that, we're removing yeast and any other particles that might cause shelf instability or off flavors in the beer, or just by tradition would be undesirable. It would be very unusual to have a lager with yeast floating in it. We also library all of our beers. We take beer from every run, the beginning, middle, and end, and we store it in 3 different conditions. The first is ideal conditions, which is cold and dark. The second is room temperature, and third is the penalty box upstairs, which is bright light and high temperatures, which really speeds up that aging process so we can see how that beer would be aging on the shelf under less than ideal conditions. The 3 beer killers are light, heat, and oxygen. We often get comments in the summertime from consumers who buy beer and then take it home 3 or 4 hours later and say that it tastes kind of off. Being in the trunk of a car at 100 degrees for even 3 or 4 hours will cause that beer to pick up stale cardboard flavors. So it's very important to keep the beer cold and dark, or at least under consistent temperatures in the cellar temperature range, 65 to 70 degrees. Every morning we meet here in the lab at 8 a.m. And we look at the results from the prior day. No matter what the numbers say, we can measure everything in the beer from the bitterness units to turbidity to the CO2 volumes, but somebody has to taste that beer before it gets packaged. So the ultimate test is, does it taste the way it's supposed to taste? And there's a group of us that are qualified to taste that beer as the final step in the process before it gets packaged each day. We recently started doing cans. This is our Snake Dog IPA. We also did Underdog. We have a small mechanical canning line. And cans were viewed as I guess a non-craft package for some time, but a lot has changed. The interior coatings that would not hold up well against high alcohol beers, that has all changed, so there's virtually no opportunity for the metal can to impart any metal flavors to the beer. There's virtually no oxygen in a can. It's impervious to light. It's lightweight. It's 100% recyclable, unlike glass. So it's become the perfect package for hikers, backpackers, people out on marinas during the summer, and about 10% of our volume these days is in cans. I'm standing in front of our filler room. This is a Krohn's filler from Germany. I would consider it the Rolls-Royce of fillers. We fill at the rate of 250 bottles per minute. We're sort of at the middle of the process. The new glass is unloaded in the back. It goes through a twist rinse where the bottles are turned upside down and sanitized and rinsed and then come into the filler. The first thing that happens is we hit it with CO2 to force the oxygen out. Again, oxygen is one of the 3 beer killers, light, heat, and oxygen. And then it immediately hits the bowl or filler that you're seeing. We have 36 heads on it. It's a gravity fill. It comes around to the right, and then it gets shot with just a small dose of hot, sterile water. That causes the beer to foam in the bottle. Then the cap is put on it. It's called cap on foam. That's another way that we ensure that we're forcing out any oxygen that might be in the headspace of the bottle. The bottles then are coming around. On the back side of this is a shower, very similar to the shower probably we all stood under this morning. That beer is rinsed off and then goes back around to our labeler on the other side of this room. We brew 24 hours a day, 6.5 days a week. we can package 3 times faster than we can brew. So what takes us 24 hours to brew, we can package in about 8 hours. This is our labeling area, and the labeler is also a Crohn's labeler, and obviously labels at the same rate that we bottle beer, 250 bottles a minute. We're packaging Underdog Atlantic Lager today. We use both a body label and a neck label. In the old days, fillers weren't quite so consistent, so neck labels would, I guess, conceal from the consumer the inconsistencies. Today, they're very consistent, and we have a fill tech here that will knock out anything that's not within our tolerances. We use the neck labels just because we like the art and we think the bat wings look cool. From here, the beer is transferred down the conveyor to our drop packer, where it's lined up. The mother cartons with the 6-packs are underneath, and the 24 bottles are dropped into the case. They go around, the case gets sealed, they go around this hobbit trail all the way around to that far corner where the yellow metal railing is, where the beer cases are palletized. The standard pallet in the beer business is 72 cases per pallet, and they get shrink wrapped and put into one of 2 coolers. The cooler to my right is a case cooler, and then we have a keg cooler in the back corner. We ship about 20 to 25,000 cases of beer per week. There are 1,900 breweries in America. We rank number 26. And right now on hand, we have about 40,000 cases of beer, about a 12-day supply.